So John, to set the context for today's discussion, tell us a little bit more about yourself and Marchex.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for the introduction. Happy to be here. If we wanted to have really entertaining dialogue, I'm not sure we're the right folks for that.
We're probably not, right?
A little bit like I do feel a little bit like I'm on an ESPN program, though. I like it.
Yeah.
So I run the data and insights arm of Marchex called the Marchex Institute. Marchex is an advertising analytics company, and what we do is we connect digital advertising. We work with marketers, and we connect digital advertising all the way through to phone sales. So if you're a brand or a small business and you sell auto insurance or you sell home security or you're a lawyer, you advertise quite a bit online. BIA Kelsey's own research shows a significant amount of advertising for all those businesses occurs digitally, yet you don't know what the phone rings, and it's a massive blind spot. So what Marchex does, we address that blind spot by connecting those two things, and then we also automatically classify every phone call that occurs using speech analytics technology to help you understand, did your advertising work, and was it successful?
Mm-hmm. Great, and I like the kind of blind spot concept, and we're going to get into all of the different ways that those concepts play out throughout this discussion. So if we go to the next slide, here's our agenda. So we first like to kind of level set on some definitions, and then the meat of this webcast will be a dialogue between John and me in which we'll kind of roll through 5 burning questions, and then we'll transition to take some of your burning questions as the audience, which you can ask in the questions dialog box on your right, as Patrick mentioned. You can ask those questions at any time, and they'll kind of pile up, and we'll go through them towards the end. So let's get started, the definitions. So if we go to the next slide, so the area we're going over today, as we alluded to, has been known by many terms. So, you know, you've probably heard it referred to as call monetization, click-to-call, call intelligence, and call analytics. And those are all certainly valid terms, but we've begun to refer to the overall area that kind of houses all of these topics as call commerce. And B.I. Kelsey's high-level definition of call commerce is that it's the art and the science of driving, tracking, and optimizing phone calls as a form of business leads in many of the ways that John characterized. So how much commerce is influenced through mobile calls? How are marketers taking advantage of these trends? And what are the best practices in driving and tracking all that activity? So these are many of the things we're going to go over today. So that's the what. Equally important probably is the why. So John, tell us why this is important. And as part of your answer, feel free to add to my definition of the what.
Sure. Yeah, I think to add a little bit to the what, if call commerce is when you pick up the phone and either buy something over the phone or make an appointment to buy something or make a reservation, like those are all things that would count as call commerce, and that's been going on for an awful long time. I think what's really unique and relevant to today's business and today's marketer is a subset of that, which I like to refer to as click-to-call commerce. That's when we find something on our mobile phones, we research, we select, we consider a product or service, then we click to call and call that business. That is absolutely exploding, and I think it's important because organizations are going to win or lose over the next 5, 10, 15 years based on how well they understand the customer, what data they have about the customer, and then how to put those insights into action to improve one's business. So for any business that relies on phone calls in part to drive sales, it's a super important topic at the moment.
Yeah, and I'm glad you specified mobile. Of course, mobile is something that really has accelerated this overall field because, one, consumer intent on mobile device, as we're going to go over, is tends to be higher than through other modalities. And then, two, the actual natural handoff, technically speaking, from different formats of mobile content or ads to a phone call is a natural one because sometimes we forget that these complicated and very capable, I should say, devices in our pockets are also telephones. We sometimes forget that in all the excitement around kind of mobile content delivery. So that's a nice segue into the first question. So thanks for that, John. So if we go to one more slide. We're going to kick off the kind of burning questions here. And the first question is really to start at kind of more basic levels with a discussion of kind of the fundamentals of human psychology and sociology. And, one of the basic drivers of the call commerce or the click-to-call commerce opportunity is the concept that we're human animals, and we're conditioned through centuries of evolution to communicate by voice. And that's going to sustain even in a digital era, and as we adopt technologies like messaging, which we're going to go over in a bit later. So the question to you, John, is why are phone calls important even in this digital age, and not just in kind of overall human communication, but particularly in commerce, as shown by some of the Google usage data on this slide?
Yeah. Well, I think there are a bunch of reasons why phone calls are super important. Just to outline the Google data, the chart on the left shows businesses where a call is very relevant, and then the reasons for calling, everything from to quickly get an answer all the way down to a consultation is required. Those are the reasons for calling. But to sort of peel back into maybe the three most essential reasons in my mind. One is I guess more practical. So many decisions, product and service decisions we make, really are made better when we have a live consultant.
Yeah.
For example, imagine there's something going on with your car, and you need to get it repaired. You might want to know things like, you might want to ask somebody, my engine light's on. What does this mean? Do I need to come in right away, or can I come in later? When I come in and drop my car off, do you have a loaner car for me? How long do you expect it to take? What are the range of prices? All those types of things, you probably want to talk to somebody. And even if you don't, even if you prefer to find all of this out on a website or do a bunch of research, it's going to take so much longer than just picking up the phone and asking. And by the way, when you ask, you can set an appointment and get everything taken care of right away. So that's sort of the practical reason.
Yep.
And that's whether it's an auto service, whether you're looking for someone to build or repair your house, really important travel decisions, financial advisor, all these are examples of where you want a consultant. But I think there's another component too, and it's an emotional one. I was just at a talk yesterday with Forrester, and they were sort of laying out the case that it's the age of the customer right now, and talked through some of the experiences that you might have as a customer that relate to more revenue. And one of those things that they outlined is an emotional connection. The more emotional of a connection you have with a brand, the more revenue you're going to receive as a business. And they looked at this across many different industries and many different types of companies. And I think when you have a positive experience over the phone, there's an emotional reaction to that is super positive. I don't know that we go into a phone call expecting it to be a pleasant. I know I haven't always felt that way when needing to call an airline or needing to call a cable or satellite company, but when I do and it's fast and it's efficient, it's expedient, and the person is friendly, I have a really positive association with that brand. So there's this sort of this human element to it that's kind of hard to quantify and measure, although I should say we have tried to quantify it and measure. And so if we hit the next slide. So Marchex released a study earlier this year that we entitled America's Call Centers Revealed. And it has all these sort of stats and facts and figures about how call centers can increase revenue. But I think that this one really speaks to the emotional component of click-to-call commerce. So what we did was we compared a random set of calls where an agent at a large client of ours answered the phone with a warm greeting. Now, some of this was subjective, but we sort of classified the call as, was this a really warm greeting, or was it sort of a terse greeting, or did the agent go right into, why are you calling? So we separated the calls that way. Then we looked at whether or not those calls actually converted into sales, and the results are pretty amazing.
Yeah.
That when the phone call is answered with a warm greeting, that the person is much more likely to buy. And I think that really speaks to the emotional component of a phone call.
Mm-hmm. It speaks to the emotional component. It also speaks to the importance of call analytics in uncovering things like this, because you can only take action towards kind of improving the rep's script or whatever that kind of second step is after you recognize that these data are prevalent. So I think that says a lot, actually. So let's go to the next one. And I think this segues nicely from the first point you made, John, about the kind of practical angle, because when you mention things such as autos, and a lot of similar categories where the product itself has a certain degree of complexity that lends itself to having, talking to a human, that tends to happen in big ticket item categories, which kind of leads to the fact that this call commerce opportunity tends to exist in areas where there's a very high lead value and there's a very high purchase, a high dollar purchase that kind of hangs in the balance. So I think that gets to the second question here, which is kind of building from that last question. You've actually done some research to quantify call commerce's actual monetary impact. And this really backs up a lot of things we're about in terms of phone calls' importance, but it does so with some hard numbers. Specifically, phone calls influence more than $1 trillion in U.S. consumer spending. So tell us about this figure and kind of what it means for marketers.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. So I worked with my team last year to launch a paper that we called, I think, the click-to-call commerce and the opportunity for marketers. And what we did was we took information, we essentially analyzed calls across all the industries where calls are important using our platform, and looked at things like how often are consumers calling. So we sized the market for number of calls, supplementing that work with the work that you've done, Mike. Second is we looked at the average purchase price of what consumers either purchased over the phone or like appointments or reservations, and how much the end value would be. And then we also used our platform to understand the conversion rate of inbound calls. And when we added all that up, we didn't know what it was going to be, but we were really surprised that it was more than $1 trillion, which is just a massive amount, and significantly more than e-commerce. But then when we sat back and thought about it, we said, everybody has auto insurance. Auto insurance is expensive. The auto insurance market, which is heavily reliant on phone calls, all by itself is almost as big as e-commerce. And the other thing that was sort of interesting that came out of this, if you can get to the next slide, please, are the individuals in our society that are actually placing these calls. So we talked at the top about call commerce, and I mentioned that a subset of this is click-to-call commerce. We're only talking about this subset, click-to-call commerce, that is $1 trillion, and it's being driven by our youngest consumers. The younger you are, the more likely you are to click to call, and I suppose it's because the younger you are, the more familiar you are with mobile search, the more likely you are to use mobile search and be influenced by mobile and go ahead to click to call. So it's really massive, and it's just continuing to grow.
Yeah, and I think there are a few important things to note too about this kind of age breakdown. One is that we're talking about at least part of the kind of millennial generation in the highest preponderance of calls happening here, and this seems to be almost contrarian, because a lot of people believe that millennials aren't picking up the phone because they're so heavily involved in messaging apps such as Facebook Messenger or Snapchat. But I think it also stands to reason if you kind of sit back and look at it, because another kind of trait of the generation that we hear about is that they value things that are genuine. And that seems to align with, conceptual at least, with, picking up the phone to talk to someone, as opposed to having these kind of commerce interactions happen in a less personal kind of medium. So it all stands to reason. It also stands to reason because of the growing buying empowerment of the millennial generation. The oldest millennials are approaching 40. and they're such a buying and power generation. So that's why this data point, I think, is that much more powerful, because paying attention to their behavior and their proclivities is increasingly important in terms of catering to it. So let's move on to the next big kind of burning question, number 3. And this drills down kind of one layer to now discuss some of the qualitative aspects of all this call activity, specifically where calls are coming from. So what are the different mobile and content ad formats that are driving calls? John, you mentioned search a lot. That's a leading category. There's also social that's growing in terms of driving calls. And then secondarily, where are calls going? So where are the business verticals that tend to receive the most calls, and why? And we even alluded to this already with talking about auto. So we're actually going to save that first part for the next question and talking about where calls are coming from in the kind of multi-screen world we live in. But for now, John, what are the trends you're seeing in terms of the destinations of calls, the different verticals or the different attributes? It doesn't have to be even verticals, the different attributes of the businesses that you're seeing, whether they're call center oriented, or what are the types of businesses that can benefit the most from phone calls and from call analytics and measuring them in a smart way?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I'll answer that question first by sort of saying the largest categories, just in terms of total
ad spend.
And you can see those on the right. Mm-hmm. They're auto, cable and telecom, financial services, home services, and travel. And I want to qualify some of these a little bit, because some of them may surprise you. In terms of travel, we're generally talking about hotels, where the phone channel represents about 30% of all bookings, and then complex, or I would say very expensive and highly considered travel, like a cruise. And cruise lines, you might have 90 to 95% of all bookings occurring over the phone, because there's so many choices that you need to make if you're going to sail around the world, let's say. And then for auto, it's not just auto repair and service, but about 40% of all consumers that buy a car end up calling on the way to qualify if there's the car, the financing, everything that they want before they bother going to the car lot. So it's a super important part of the process. But beyond that, there are a whole bunch of smaller categories where calls are essential. And at Marchex, we tend to work not directly with individual businesses, but with marketing service providers that solve marketing challenges for these businesses. So if you go to the next slide, you can just see some of the others. And it's more or less anybody that would have advertised in the Yellow Pages, or still does advertise in the book, Yellow Pages. Calls are super important. What this data shows, for each of these industries, like in the middle, you see dentists, landscaping and pest control, legal services. The magenta or purple are the percentage of calls that are really deep product inquiries. Like, they might not buy over the phone, but it seems like they may buy in the future. And then the blue portions of each of these bars are actual sales and appointments that occur. So calls are heading to these businesses, and they're really converting into real dollars.
Absolutely, and if you kind of sit back and array this kind of conversion rate, if you were to call it that, to kind of conversion rates you see in a lot of other media, this very much over-indexes in terms of just performance. So I think this is a strong metric. So if we move on to the next slide, which is burning question number 4, this drills down a bit on the kind of previous question of where calls are coming from. And the fact that the answer to that question is many places. And not just many places, but the consumer path to purchase, as we call it, is increasingly kind of weaving in and out of several different screens, which makes ROI attribution, of course, difficult. It's one of the biggest kind of pain points in today's world of advertising and marketing. So the question is, how do phone calls fit into this kind of multi-screen world, and what is Marchex doing to kind of engineer call intelligence so that the phone call can be kind of a connective tissue in that kind of cross-platform attribution dilemma that we're all facing?
Yeah, this is probably the most burning of all the burning questions in
Right.
my mind because,
Burning in terms of its pain level, right?
yeah, burning in terms of its pain level. I'd say that marketers that I talk to um, know that there's a ton of mobile data at their disposal, but it's difficult to harness it and take action from it. We know that today's consumer uses many screens and many platforms to make decisions, and that consumer is going online and offline and online and offline, and back again. I think our goal with Marchex is to be able to connect all of the individual touch points that a consumer makes before that phone call so that the marketer can truly understand the consumer journey and also make better decisions about where to advertise and what to advertise. I'd say that there are two things that we've discovered in the last year that are being reflected in our product development that are pretty important. If you hit the next slide, I'll talk through one of them. So the call analytics space or the call tracking space historically has been focused on, let's say, last click attribution. So where exactly did that phone call come from? Did it come from a search ad or did it come from my website? And if it came from a search ad, which keyword? All of that is really important. Like, what's the thing that created that action to call? But consumers are exposed to digital ads prior to making that search that influences their decision. And we have a product called Marchex Display Analytics that is able to match up a consumer's exposure to a display ad all the way through to a phone call that occurs to a call center 2 weeks later. And this data point, I think, is really interesting. We found that it takes about 500,000 impressions on average to generate a phone call from a click-to-call display ad. But it only takes 8,000 impressions on average for a display ad to influence a future phone call within 2 weeks of exposure. So oftentimes the brands that we work with, they advertise on social, advertise on display, and when they look at traditional call metrics, like how many calls are coming from those ad units, they're often, they're disappointed. Or put another way, they don't have a way to prove what they think is true, which is that this is influencing consumer behavior. Well, we're actually showing them that it does. If you go to the next slide, there's another really interesting development in communication between businesses and consumers, and that's via text or messaging. And so there are a lot of questions that come from this. Who's going to want to text a business? Why? How does this impact the consumer path to purchase? Will it replace some other form of communication? This is, and sorry for the text rather than a graphic, but this data comes from trials that we've done where on a mobile landing page, we provide the option to text and also the option to place a phone call, the option to email, and the option to fill out a form. So here's what we found. In our trials, more than 20% of text to business, so when someone actually chose to text, it led to phone calls or in-person conversations. And what's more, because the text sort of pre-qualified the consumer, phone calls were shorter, initial questions had already been answered, and these calls convert at more than double the rate of a typical call, one that was not preceded by a message. So this is just another thing that marketers have to take into account, that messaging impacts the consumer path to purchase, but it's also not something that's going to replace a phone call, but sort of enhances the overall customer experience.
Yeah, I think that pre-qualification point is a key one, because this is another kind of contrarian point, along with the millennial one we talked about earlier, where a lot of people are watching the massive growth in the messaging sector. I mentioned a few of them earlier. Facebook Messenger now has over 1 billion users. We have Snapchat and others, and increasingly these are being used to text not just your friends but businesses. So the logical extension of that a lot of people have reached is that it's going to kill the phone call, and that's clearly not the case when it's actually assisting this overall area of call commerce by the pre-qualification point you made and just making kind of higher value calls. And even if it does erode any call volume we've concluded that that's all. It's going to mostly happen at the low end with things that are the low value calls anyway, such as calling for directions or that kind of just low friction information. And it's going to sustain as a really valuable medium calls for the higher value stuff. And the pre-qualification point, I think, is another key one. These are all things we discuss in the white paper as well. So I encourage everyone to download that. So let's go to the next question. This is the final burning question, winding down here. And this is meant to kind of bring it all home with some kind of examples of best practices. So given everything we just talked about, John, where are some of these real-life examples from the field? And what are some recommendations, building from that you have for the folks listening that would like to improve their marketing effectiveness in all the ways that we're talking about?
Yeah. Thanks, Mike. This is really the question about how do we take all of this and put it into action. And maybe the last slide that I'll show has some of the specific actions, but maybe before then, I'll talk through a component of call analytics that is super important. We call it at Marchex conversational analytics. And what you're seeing on screen is a visual map of a phone call. This is our product called Marchex Call DNA. And if you think about the richest possible data you could have about your products and your customers, it's what a customer says when they're purchasing a product. There's literally nothing better than that. And what we do at Marchex is we automatically score, classify, house all this rich data about phone calls. So as a marketer, you can make better decisions. If you hit the next slide, this just gives an example of how we use conversational analytics or Marchex Call DNA to provide insights on a category basis. What you're looking at from top to bottom are features that consumers ask about when purchasing a cable or satellite package, and then the ratio of whether men or women tend to ask about this feature. And this has a lot of rich data that has implications for marketing. For instance, if you know a certain type of consumer is interested in sports or a certain type of consumer is interested in Spanish, then Spanish-speaking content, then you can tailor your ads or creative to that. It can also lead to new product investments. Notice how often consumers are asking about basic cable. There's a lot of talk in the industry today about skinny bundles and their importance to millennials and younger buyers. Well, it turns out that's the second most important feature that a consumer asks about. And so that's insight into how marketers can tailor their product bundles and product roadmap around what they're hearing in real time. It's like real-time analytics, I guess. Yeah. And so if you go to the next slide, I can talk through what I put together. It's a 3-step guide for marketers, and I'll just give a couple of examples of clients. So the first thing that we would recommend is to make sure you're adding a phone number in paid search campaigns and on every single mobile landing page for social and display campaigns, and to ensure your phone number is visible from your website and app. Just correcting that will lead to more calls and more sales. The second thing to do is to implement call tracking technology. Of course, we can provide that for you, to easily assign credit to your marketing campaigns. That will allow you to track revenue by media source and improve your media performance. And then third, leverage the advanced features to gain a unified view of the customer journey to power your engagement efforts. So I'll give 2 examples of that. One example is media efficiency. So I just got this data this week. We worked with a large insurance client, and they implemented our call tracking technology to understand by the search keyword, and they have hundreds of thousands of keywords, which ones are driving calls and which of those calls actually lead to quotes or insurance policies. And by understanding that and manipulating their search bids, for every dollar they spent with Marchex, they received 3 incremental dollars in revenue, which is massive for a search campaign that they've been running for a decade. That's an example of media efficiency using call analytics. An example of sales efficiency is we work with an auto services provider, like one where you'd go change your oil, change your tires, that sort of thing, where they used the conversation analytics to understand when the people answering the phone at individual locations were not very good at getting people to make appointments. And they're implementing a training program that they believe will equate to an incremental $100 million in revenue. So it's really massive.
Yeah, and that goes back to the point I mentioned earlier of the data can really uncover some of these things that then lead to the actionable steps. So appreciate all those concrete examples. I think that really grounds the discussion. So now we're going to move into some audience questions in the remaining few minutes we have, and give you guys the chance, the audience, to ask your own burning questions. So I'll remind the audience, pose the questions in the dialog box on the right of the GoToWebinar interface. We already have several questions coming in here, and we'll do our best to answer all of them. For any questions we don't get to, we will answer offline because there are a lot of them here. We only have a few minutes. First, there's kind of a clarifying question. Is the industry analysis based on U.S. data only? I'll mention that some of the monetary figures, like the 1 trillion in influence of consumer spending that calls have, or click-to-call commerce has, I believe that was a U.S. figure. Some of the Google data around the percentage of users that are opting to pick up the phone for various reasons, that was one of the first slides. I believe that Google data is global. John, I'll let you answer the question of some of your Marchex data that you showed, whether that's U.S. or global.
By and large, the data is U.S. data. However, I should note that that we've done studies for other parts of the English-speaking market, UK and Australia, where we size those and have a lot of the same stats. We also have clients in other parts of Western Europe, so a lot of the same logic applies. I'd say the sophistication of digital marketing in each country kind of relates to the growth of click-to-call commerce, I would say, in that country.
Yeah. I think that the market sizing data and like dollars spent and things like that is important to distinguish between U.S. versus global. When we talk about kind of consumer behavior and affinity and sentiment, a lot of that tends to be pretty universal. Next question. This one is for you, John, I presume. What's the market adoption of call analytics, which I think may be going for kind of like the penetration, the market penetration? What does that look like?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's difficult to know the exact answer of that. We partnered with a company to do a survey of mobile marketers at the end of last year, and when it came to the question of measuring call commerce, way at the top of the list in terms of what marketers felt would be the most beneficial was implementing call analytics technology. But in terms of the actual adoption rate, it's about 30% of those businesses or big brands, or at least people that answered our survey, that were in industries that could really benefit from it, are actually adopting it. So there's, so we're still in the, I would say, the early adoption period.
Now, I'm going to actually add to that question and incorporate another question that's asked here in the question box and add my own spin on it too. You know, we talked about different verticals where call commerce makes sense. What about looking at it kind of horizontally? And what I mean by that is like the large national advertisers that might have like localized constituents and are localizing campaigns in different ways. It's the kind of national local kind of segment, as we call it. And then also kind of the small business SMB segment. When you look at how the adoption you just went over, how that arrays across like the size of business, well, what does that look like now?
Well, I'd say a lot of the folks that we've just started to work with in the last year or two are these national, local types of businesses, because it's often where you have the greatest blind spot.
Yeah.
If you have a call center, at least you have some call center disposition data, and you can try to sort of make sense of that. When the calls that you're driving as a national brand actually go to an individual location, it's a massive, massive blind spot, and there's so many opportunities for improvement generally when we go in and help a customer understand what their data says. When it comes to a small business that's unaffiliated with a big brand, the same thing applies when you when you think about a marketing solutions provider like YP that works with thousands of small businesses, they can help small businesses understand the impact of their digital marketing programs by implementing call analytics.
So primarily the path to those small businesses will usually be through kind of resellers that can kind of hold their hand and help them implement it, right?
Yeah, in my experience, yes.
Yeah. So another question here, which I think is kind of timely for the, entering the holiday season, how does showrooming impact phone calls and click-to-call?
So that's the concept, like where you're at an auto dealer and you're looking at you're sort of seeing, can I buy the car cheaper somewhere
You're looking
else?
for something cheaper online on your phone, and then you walk away because you found it. Is that whole kind of concept, is that a negative or a positive for this area?
I wouldn't say it's negative or positive. I would say that it's an opportunity. Like if a consumer goes to any place where there's a competition, like an AT&T store versus a Sprint store or something like that, you go in and you're not totally satisfied, or you're not totally sure you've made the right choice, and it's one of those products you just can't go on and buy on Amazon instead.
Yeah.
A phone call is a totally natural way to comparison shop. So anyway, the scenario is more like, look at what's around you, look at alternatives on your phone, and then click to call. So it's interesting. We're trying to understand how often it occurs.
Well, it could be the same concept you mentioned for messaging, where it'll actually be it'll create a wider top of the funnel for phone calls by having like that pre-qualification through a showroom experience that actually ends up driving phone calls where people want to qualify that comparative shopping.
Right.
So we have time for one more question here. I think this is an interesting one, which is how does call analytics fit into the kind of overall marketing technology stack, which is, of course, something that is evolving so quickly. We have kind of enterprise dynamics changing. We have the world of Martech that is really kind of rising. How does call analytics kind of fit into all that?
Yeah, I would say that that the last generation of digital marketing was trying to create this closed loop for everything that occurs in e-commerce and that occurs online. So you'd create this marketing technology that helps to understand and make sense of those scenarios. I think what we're finding, and it's a trend we really like to see, is that marketers aren't saying we're going to treat our e-commerce path one way and then we're going to work with Marchex for call analytics and sort of put it off over here and analyze the call channel. What we're seeing is that marketers want our data inserted into the platforms and services that they already use to make better digital marketing decisions, or that they put into their database that understands customer experience. So it's great. We're seeing this online and offline data coming together into a single stack, and it's happening in all different kinds of ways because there's no dominant player in this area, as opposed to, I'm not going to use Adobe, Oracle, IBM, and my backend.
Well, that modularity seems like it empowers marketers to take best of breed stuff from all over the place and bring it together. And I think one thing I'll add there in terms of just enterprise dynamics and the evolution of the enterprise these days is that, we're seeing kind of the buying environment change where marketers are more empowered in the kind of SaaS era to basically be able to have the budget and pick and implement things without the sign-off of the IT department and a bunch of red tape and having on-site servers. I think just that overall environment makes implementing things like call commerce that much easier for marketers. And that goes back to the kind of famous Gartner quote of the CMO is going to have a bigger tech budget than the CIO by, I believe the quote was by the end of 2017, which is kind of upon us. So I think that in addition to all of the benefits we just went over, one other level to all of this is that for marketers it's just that much easier to kind of implement from just an organizational or a budgetary or kind of political kind of perspective within the enterprise. So on that note, we're going to conclude the questions, and I just have a few minutes here that I wanted to reserve for some giveaways. To thank you all for your time in joining us today. So first, we have a free white paper that I wrote, and I mentioned this earlier, and it goes into detail on lots of the data and insights about call commerce and the opportunity and what makes it tick, a lot of the things we talked about today. So for those of you watching live, there's a bit.ly link that you can use to download that white paper for free. Anyone who gets this deck, which will be available after the webinar, you can also just click on the graphic to launch the link for the reports landing page to download. And then the second thing we want to make you aware of, if you go to the next slide, speaking of reports, is that I'm in the process of producing our next big white paper that will be published in early January. And this is a deep dive into our latest mobile ad revenue forecast. So it looks at all the drivers and the trends and revenue opportunities in mobile advertising that will get us to what we're projecting as a $72 billion mobile ad market by 2020. And that's everything from search to display ads to messaging and video and some of the things we went over today, including click-to-call commerce, which is part of this figure in terms of the revenue that's driving from ad placements. So look out for that report in the coming weeks, and in the meantime, you can get the executive summary if you tweet at us. That's at @BIKelsey. Use the hashtag 72bpreview, and we will DM you a copy. So that concludes our webcast today. If we go to the next slide, if you have questions, you can contact John and/or me at the contact information you can see here. John, I want to thank you for your time and insights.
Thanks, Mike. Thank you. Glad to be here.
Yep, and thank you all for joining us today, the audience. And at this point, I'll pass it back to Patrick for final housekeeping.
Thanks a lot, Mike. Thanks, everybody, for attending. Just a reminder on the way out, we do have a quick survey we'd like to fill out about today's webinar to keep us more informed. And other than that, like Mike said, look out for your email tomorrow with the on-demand webinar as well as the slide deck. So thank you for attending, everybody, today, and have a good day. Thank you very much.